Welcome back to the daily Living Jewish Kitzur Shulchan Aruch class. We are up to section 71 of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. We are learning about how to go to sleep like a mensch or as a Jew. Just to briefly recap where we're up to, we are in the section that deals with the evening prayers. We spoke about davening mincha. We spoke about davening ma'ariv, and now we are up to the order of the night, section 71. Well, most recently we spoke about how the importance of learning, studying Torah at night, not just during the day, but at night as well. Certainly, if you had a daily shiur, a daily class during the day, and you missed it, then you should make up for it once it's evening. I know certainly for myself in a home with young children, as long as the day is still ticking, it's hard to be able to just sit down and learn. But once it's night and people go to sleep, that is a great opportunity to see what needs to be caught up, see that we're learning. Ideally, we should have a time designated, a subject designated to be studied at night, or at the very least, make sure to catch any shiurim that we missed during the day. Then we spoke about supper and sleep. We spoke about how a person shouldn't eat too much just before they go to sleep. That could affect their dreams, and it's not very healthy. Although, as one of you pointed out, back in the day, people would go to sleep as soon as it got dark. And so there wasn't much time. They'd eat supper and then go to sleep. But I do think that today, where the person's eating dinner at 6 o'clock and they're only going to sleep at 9 or 10 or 11, I think there is that concern of having a large supper would not apply. About sleep, interestingly, although the Rambam mentions 8 hours of sleep, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch mentions 6 hours of sleep. And the bottom line is that each person should do according to what they need. There isn't a set formula. Different people need different amounts of sleep. So speak to your local doctor or health advisor. But that's part of halacha. Part of keeping Jewish law is making sure that we're healthy and that we are getting the necessary amount of sleep. Most recently, we spoke about the importance of teshuvah. How on a grand scale, once a year, or not just once a year, as we come up to Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, it's a time to, in the days leading up, we do early morning slichas, and we think about how we could repair that which we've done during the day. But on a minor scale, teshuvah is something that we should strive to achieve on a daily basis. Well, as long as the day is still ticking, we want to get as much done as we can. It's not a time to start questioning how we are performing. It's a time to just do more. But once we're ready to go to sleep and there's nothing more that can be said for that day, then it is an appropriate time to stop, to take stock, to think how the day was, and think how, in Hasidic terminology, morgen wird sein gar anders, how tomorrow can be so much better. We spoke about also, when saying the Shema at night, forgiving anybody that may have wronged us, just as we want Hashem to forgive us. So see, this is actually where we're up to. Halacha number 4. Let's look at it inside. Yeah, the last point we spoke about is just as we want Hashem to forgive us for anything we did wrong and to give us another chance, we turn to Hashem and we say, we forgive others that may have hurt us as well. It's a beautiful prayer right at the beginning of the Shema before going to sleep. I hereby forgive anybody that got me angry, that instigated me, etc., etc. Halacha number 4. As far as the evening prayers, not ma'ariv, more specifically, the prayers that we say just before we go to sleep. So for starters, if you did not recite the 3 chapters of Shema after nightfall, so for example, if you went to shul, and you daven mincha just before sunset, or well before sunset, like now in Johannesburg, where sunset is only at about 10 to 7 and mincha is at 6 o'clock. And immediately after mincha, the minyan proceeded to daven ma'ariv is, as we discussed in the previous section, that the rabbis instituted that although generally one is not allowed to daven Ma'ariv before 3 stars come out, we mentioned that in order to have a minyan, if the minyan are not going to stick around, then we should daven Ma'ariv even while it's still day, so that we have the power of davening Ma'ariv with the minyan. So when we do that, we have the mitzvah of davening Ma'ariv, the rabbinic mitzvah of davening Ma'ariv, but we don't have the mitzvah of saying the morning and evening Shema. So we say the Shema, you should love Hashem. And these words should be, which I'm commanding you today, on your heart. You should teach them to your children. And say them. When you go to sleep and when you get up. So every day we say in the Shema that Hashem gives every one of us a special opportunity, the mitzvah, to say the Shema twice a day. Once in the morning and once at night. So there is a biblical mitzvah, there's a requirement and opportunity for every single Jew to say the Shema twice a day. Now, when should it be said? When you go to sleep and when you get up. Or as our rabbis explained, it means when most people go to sleep and when most people get up. Which means that the Shema can only be recited at a time that most people get up, which is once it starts getting light, although some people get up before it gets light, that's not the regular. And it can only be said at a time that most people go to sleep, which is after it's completely dark. So to fulfill the mitzvah of saying Shema twice a day, it needs to be recited once in the morning, early morning, and once it's fully night. So if you went to shul at 6 o'clock and you davened Milcha, and right after that you davened Ma'ariv, which was the right thing to do, so that you could daven with a minyan, so you have the mitzvah of davening Ma'ariv, the evening prayers, but you don't have the mitzvah of saying Shema at night, because it's not yet completely night. So for starters, if you did not recite the 3 chapters of Shema after nightfall, either because you didn't daven Ma'ariv at all, which he doesn't mention, or it may be because that's something we strive to ensure doesn't happen, whether it's because we're not davening Ma'ariv or it's because we daven Ma'ariv early, then you should say all 3 chapters again when you say the Shema before going to sleep. If you did recite them at night, meaning you daven Ma'ariv with the minyan, so you've already fulfilled the mitzvah of saying Shema at a time that people go to sleep, because once it gets dark, people start going to sleep. Then all that you are required to recite in the Shema before bed, in Kriyash V'Shalamita, is the first chapter itself. So you've already fulfilled the mitzvah of saying Shema twice a day, but you still need to say the Shema before going to sleep. But at this point, it's enough to just recite the first paragraph. Nevertheless, to fulfill the mitzvah in its excellence, you should recite all 3 chapters. So that's for starters. You're about to go to sleep, and the first thing you need to ask yourself is, did I recite the Shema at night? And if you did not yet recite the Shema at night, then make sure to do so now. The Kabbalists tell us that by concentrating when saying the Shema just before going to sleep, a person kills any bodies of spiritual harbors. There are what's called spiritual energies, spiritual entities. I don't know if you've heard of it in the form of demons. Maybe it's a whole class in its own right. But the idea is that as long as we're awake, we're in control. When we go to sleep, it could God forbid happen that we could be affected by a negative energy, whether it be a physical person that comes and wants to cause damage through, I don't know, robbing or any of that stuff that should never happen to any of us, or a spiritual person, meaning a spiritual energy like a shade, which could also cause harm to a person while he's sleeping. So whether it's any of these 2 energies, we want to be sure that we are not harmed by them. So the Kabbalists tell us that by concentrating, when you say the Shema before you go to sleep, you actually execute any of these negative energies so that you won't be harmed when you are not in your full senses. When we do say the Shema, So we're actually doing two mitzvahs. In addition to saying the Shema, which is a daily command, we're also remembering what Amalek, the nation that tried to destroy us, did to us. So that's in the third paragraph of the Shema. We just mentioned that before going to sleep, if you've already said the evening Shema, you could just say the first paragraph, but preferably you should say all three. And that again would be mentioning the third paragraph, which speaks about remembering what Amalek did to us, which is a mitzvah in its own right, which also has this added reason to do it again before going to sleep. Now, why do we say the Shema before going to sleep if we've already said it earlier in the day? So the Talmud relates, the Gemara says that the person should ensure that he has words of Torah or requests to Hashem made before he goes to sleep. So, in other words, there's an idea that right before we turn our neshama to Hashem, we want to utilize that opportunity to turn to Hashem and ask for what we need. And some say that we actually say it simply as added protection. So just like you're putting on your alarm before you go to sleep to make sure that you're physically protected, you want to make sure that you're spiritually protected, and you do so by saying the Shema. The Shema gives us spiritual protection before going to sleep, as well as fulfilling the dictates of the Talmud that right before we go to sleep at night, we turn to Hashem and we speak to Him one additional time for this last day that we have. We'll never have today again. We'll have tomorrow, but today is going to end. And before today ends, right before we go to sleep, we want to turn to Hashem with the final prayer. So those are the two main reasons why we make a prayer before we go to sleep. Firstly, to turn to Hashem and ask Him for our needs right before we sleep. And secondly, to protect ourselves from any negative influence. Now, why would you say all three paragraphs? Why would it be enough to just say the first paragraph? So, interestingly, if you were to count every word in the Shema in all three paragraphs, it totals 248 words. There are exactly 248 words from the beginning of the Shema till the end of the Shema. Maybe that's with repeating Hashem Lekechem Emes. I'm not sure. But either way, there's 248 words in the Shema. Our sages tell us that there are also 248 limbs in the body. So by saying the Shema in all three paragraphs, Shema, Vahaya, and Vayomer, we bring protection on every one of the limbs of our body, or we connect every one of the limbs of our body to Hashem one last time before we go to sleep. And then we continue with some other verses, some other psalms, according to the different Sidurim, each according to their custom. Now, the commentaries ask, you're not supposed to use the Torah as a personal axe. What does that mean? You're not supposed to take that's actually the ethics of our fathers. You're not supposed to take something godly and use it for personal benefits. It sounds now like we're taking prayer or Torah study and we're using it for personal protection. So it's using it for personal gain. Is this not misappropriation? Is this not me'ileh? Is this not misuse? So the commentaries of the Shulchan Aruch say that it's one thing to use something for personal gain. There's another thing to use Torah just as protection to prevent us from being harmed. And that is allowed. Also specifically regarding the mezuzah, although usually we're not supposed to use mitzvahs for personal gain, you are allowed to use a mezuzah to prevent us from being harmed. It's one thing to take something holy and use it for selfish benefits. It's another thing to utilize it to give us added protection. This is something that is allowed. Interestingly, he mentions many of the Sidurim have the blessing of Hamapil, which is a final bracha before we go to sleep. Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you Hashem, who puts sleep on our eyes. So many of the Sidurim have that prayer of Hamapil earlier in the Siddur. The Kitzur Shulchan Aruch says it's better to say it right before you go to sleep so that it goes immediately before sleeping. So just as any other mitzvah that you do, first you make a bracha and then you do the mitzvah, or any other benefit that you have. First you make the bracha, and then you eat the bread, and you're not supposed to talk between making the bracha and eating the bread, so you shouldn't speak between saying Hamapil and going to sleep. Therefore, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch suggests saying the blessing of Hamapil, not where it's situated in the Siddur, which still has a few other prayers following it, but rather to say it immediately before sleep. There are obviously different opinions because There are still some Siddurim that have it earlier for whatever reason, which I didn't look into. So practically, I would say ask your local Orthodox rabbi what is best for you or what his tradition is. Before going to bed, you should walk over to the mezuzah, place your fingers on it, and say, Hashem Shoimri B'Gomer. So Hashem is my keeper, although this is mentioned in the Kitzur, and this is not at least practiced in some communities. I'm not sure if it's something that you've seen being done. So the Kitzur, after all, is just an abbreviated collection of all of Jewish law, and sometimes there are different opinions within Jewish law. And this is one of those scenarios where one needs to say special verses while touching the mezuzah before going to sleep. Again, you can check with your local Orthodox rabbi. Okay. Once you've said the blessing of Amapil, which is recited right before going to sleep, you shouldn't eat or drink or speak until you fall asleep. So just like you don't speak between making a bracha and eating, between saying Avodah and eating, when you say this final blessing of Amapil, which is asking Hashem to give you sleep, immediately after that you should go to sleep. What happens if you can't fall asleep? So you could say the Shema again, and the Psalms again, and the verses of mercy again, and you could keep saying them until you fall asleep. Or you could say the verses of Torat Sivalada Moshe Barasha Kilas Yaakov, or Eish Tamid, or Sa'afim Sadesi, or Zarua, until overcome by sleep. So once you made the bracha, you want to be focused on Hashem and on falling asleep until you actually fall asleep, so there isn't any interruption. This reading is also preventative against nocturnal emissions, heaven forbid. Again, we want to avoid wasting seed. And that could be avoided by having added words of prayer just before going to sleep. Now, perhaps most importantly, your purpose for sleeping should be to strengthen yourself for the service of your master. Thereby, it will be considered as serving Hashem. So even when we sleep, we're serving Hashem. If you intend to engage in marital relations, you should not recite the bracha of Amapil first, but rather afterwards. That way, you should recite at least the first chapter of the Shema, and then Hamapil, and then go to sleep. So again, we want to make sure that this final blessing for sleep is said immediately before going to sleep. What happens if a person is hungry after they've already gotten into bed and they've already said the Shema? So they can still go back and eat something as long as they haven't yet said the prayer of Hamapil. Once they've said the prayer of Hamapil, then they shouldn't eat anything at that point. Certainly, also we mentioned about only saying the first paragraph of the Shema Hamapil after, if a person is engaging in marital relations. Of course, a person would first need to wash themselves in a way that would allow them to be mentioning Hashem's name. That brings us to 5:20. Please God, tomorrow we will learn about how we actually get into pajamas and get into a good sleeping position. So if you're struggling to fall asleep, stay tuned for some good ideas.